History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Now, the reason I start with that quote is because during Advent this year, the 4 Sundays leading up for Christmas, we're going to be looking at the Old Testament book of Ruth, and you might have thought I've lost my ever-loving mind, which I might have, right? So why would we look at Ruth during the weeks that we're supposed to be looking at the birth story of Jesus? Well, it's because of that history doesn't repeat itself, but history often rhymes. And it's okay if you don't know the whole story of Ruth yet, because we're going to encounter it this Advent, but there's a lot of rhyming that goes on between Ruth and between Jesus, okay? Here's just a couple of things. First of all, the story of Ruth is the story about the faithfulness of one young woman. Does that not connect with Advent when we talk about Mary? The story of Ruth all happens around Bethlehem. And if that doesn't ring a bell for you, I don't know what will. But these events about God providing bread for his people in a famine-stricken land, and would not Jesus be the ultimate fulfillment of that and being the bread of life? One of the things we'll talk about quite extensively this morning is that when we experience pain, it's not that God's plan has stopped. In fact, it's through our pain that God will oftentimes accomplish his plan. We see pain and plan as two different things, but they might be married a whole lot closer than what we think. But here's the biggie. The story of Ruth is about the coming of a king. It's about how Ruth would be found in the lineage of David, the quintessential king of Israel. Now that should ring a bell as well, because the whole story of Advent is about the coming of a king who would be the son of David. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And it's going to rhyme as we look at and explore the story of Ruth. Before we read Ruth 1, though, I want to show you a quick picture. This picture was taken by Louis Daguerre in 1838. It's a Paris street. Now, just real quick, this is not a photograph in the sense that you and I would know it. It's called the daguerreotype, and a plate was exposed to the light, and it had to be exposed for about 10 minutes in order for the image to register on that plate. Now, this looks like an empty Paris street, but actually is a very busy Paris street, but all the people were moving by so quickly that their image didn't have time to register on the glass plate. However, during this 10-minute time that Louis Daguerre was exposing this plate to the light, there was one man, you see him about 9 o'clock, there he is. He's getting his shoe shined on a street corner. And he's standing there long enough for his image to be captured. This is 1838. This is the very first photograph taken of a person. You're looking at it right now. This person, and we'll never know who he is, he was making history without even knowing it. We don't know what Ruth was aware of or not. Did she understand she was in the middle of history? We don't know that, but she was making history, and I think probably without fully knowing it, without fully understanding it. So each week during Advent, we're going to read an entire chapter of Ruth, okay? Did I just hear a person moan in this room right now? Ooh, okay. Let me ask you to step up your game here a little bit. So each chapter just takes about 3.5 minutes to read, but the challenge is not to phase out, not to just kind of gloss over. What I would encourage you to do is two things. I would encourage you to tap into your inner cinematographer. Maybe picture a young widow who you know and have her be the face of Ruth. Imagine these scenes playing out in your mind. Use your imagination. I would also encourage you, as Marissa reads here in just a moment, and I think it's very important that we have a female voice read this because it's the story of a woman. I would encourage you to lean into one word or one phrase that would capture your attention. I'll tell you what mine is in a few moments. Now, in the next 3.5 minutes, will you glaze over? Yes, you will. What should you do if that happens? You should feel guilty. But then get over that and just get your attention back on the scripture. So let's listen to Ruth chapter 1. And by the way, when Marissa finishes, she'll say, "This is the word of the Lord." And the historic response of the church down through the ages has been, "Thanks be to God." So let's listen with gratitude.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So this opens with the entire book of Ruth in the time of the Judges, which if you're looking at the book of Ruth, and the book of Ruth starts on the right page, if you look back on the left page, you're going to see a whole book called the book of Judges. What this was a very unsettled era. It was a time between, and you remember Moses brought the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery, brought them across the desert in 40 years, and then Joshua brought them into the Holy Land. And when Joshua died, between his death and Saul ascending as king, there was about a 200-year gap. And this was an era, some people have called it the dark ages of the Israelite community. It was a time of moral compromise. It was a time of spiritual failure. It was a time of disobedience. In fact, the refrain of the book of Judges was, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, people were just making it up as they went along. They were just doing whatever felt good in the moment. Is this sounding familiar to anybody else but me? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so what happened in the time of Ruth, it also happened in the time of Jesus being born under the Roman Empire. It's happening in our own day. There's this unsettled sense that the world is just not as it should be. But then enter Naomi and Ruth and Orpah and Elimelech and his sons. Famine has stricken the land, so they go off in desperation. They kind of go to another part of the country, to Moab, because maybe they'll be able to eke out a living there. But things only go from bad to worse right? So what we have here, a couple things I need to back up and say here. What we have here is a beautiful picture of God working even in unsettling times. You probably don't know the name Edward Manet, but he's an artist. He would do these big canvases, feet upon feet of canvas, and he would always be displeased with the entire work, but then he would see one section, and he'd go, oh, this is good. And so he would cut out just a small section of the entire canvas, and it would stand alone. In fact, in the Cincinnati Museum of Art, there's an Edward Manet that's there. It's called Women at the Races. It's just a 13 by 17 excerpt. It's a cutout of a much larger piece that he thought was just terrible. So here we have this whole canvas of the era of Judges, and everything is just messy, but right in the middle of it is this masterpiece of God working in some individuals' lives. Again, it's not easy. It might be painful, but in the pain, God was fulfilling his plan. So we see this little image in the era of the Judges. So Naomi and Elimelech, they go off to Moab. There the sons meet and marry. But then over the course of 10 years, their life falls apart. Elimelech, the father of the family, dies. The two sons die. Now, there would be some people who might breathe out condemnation at this point. They say, well, that should teach you to leave God's place and go to Moab. And there are probably people who are condemning them because life had gone from bad to worse. But for Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, life was just about as difficult as they could ever possibly imagine it. Would you hang on to that one idea again? Just because life is pain doesn't mean that God has stopped working his plan. And so the word for me that I have held on to as I read through chapter 1 is the word without in verse 5. Naomi looks up and she is without a home, without a husband, without sons. She has her daughter-in-laws there, but everyone in her immediate family and every resource she'd ever learned to depend on was gone. I don't know if you've heard the story of Deron Spoo. He lives in Nevada County, I said this wrong in the first service too, Nevada County, California, one of the most sparsely populated counties in the entire United States. And he lives in a home out in the middle of nowhere. And you'll never guess what happened. A meteorite came out of the sky and crashed into his house and burned the whole thing down. If it weren't for the tragedy, there's actually a security camera that picks up this meteorite coming out of nowhere and just with a bullseye going straight to his house. Those who work in statistics says it was a 1 in 4 trillion chance that his house was destroyed. Deron Spoo heard that statistic and he said, I'm going out to buy a lottery ticket right now. Don't you know Naomi had to feel that way? What, do I have a target on my back? First I deal with famine, then I move to try to provide for my family, and my husband dies, and my boys die, and now I am without. I don't know if you feel that way this morning, but if you do, hang on, okay? Because your pain does not mean that God's plan has stopped in your life. So, Naomi's kind of hit bottom. Now, before we go any further, I really do need to explain the whole idea of levirate marriage. And for some of you, you've never heard that phrase before. It sounds a little archaic, and maybe it is, but here's the way it would happen in the ancient world. And by the way, just a warning label here. This is going to sound really creepy, but this is meant actually as an act of compassion. That when a woman was brought into a family by marriage, that family made a covenant with her. It just wasn't the husband bringing her into the family. It was the entire family to say, you are ours. From now on, we're going to take care of you. So much so that if you marry into our family and the oldest brother dies, then we'll hand you down to the next oldest brother. Sounds a little creepy, right? But actually, it was meant because there was no social security system, there was no backup plan, that we're going to keep you in the family, and the living brother will have children in the dead brother's name. It's called levirate marriage. And so to understand the depth of loss, Naomi looks at Orpah and Ruth, and she goes, girls, I have no more sons. I know you made a covenant into our family, but I have no more sons. In fact, even if I were to get married tonight, instantly get pregnant, are you going to wait 18 years for this son to come of age? I have nothing left to give you. So that's when a decision takes place. We see two very different reactions. First, you see Orpah. Now, I want to pause here and tell you a little bit of trivia about Orpah. I'm not going to say what she did was wrong. I'm going to say what she did was not best. Orpah followed common sense. Have you ever heard common sense is a superpower? Have you ever heard that before? Have you ever felt that? You know, you think common sense would be pretty easy to come by. It's not, right? Orpah had this great common sense. And by the way, use your common sense. But there's going to come times when our faith needs to trump that common sense. So Orpah says, okay, there's nothing here for me, so I'm going to go back to my own people. And Orpah disappears from the pages of the Bible and from the annals of history. Two little pieces of trivia you might not know about Orpah. In the last century, in the 1900s, there was a woman born to her family, and the family wanted to give her a biblical name. The letters were mixed up a little bit, and she is known as Oprah, right? So just a little piece of trivia. Aren't you glad you came to church today? The other piece of trivia is if you take 4th Street here and you walk from 4th Street down from our church to the BOK Center, you're going to pass a little bar on the left called Orpah's Lounge. So what I think happened is Orpah left Naomi, moved to Tulsa, started a little seedy lounge down the street from First Baptist Tulsa. Don't ask me how I know it's on the left, but it's on the left, okay? No, we don't know what happened to her. She just disappears. But Ruth, she clings to her mother-in-law. So here's the most important verse. In fact, go back to verse 13. This is the second most important verse in the book of Ruth, in my estimation. She says, because the Lord's hand is turned against me. That's what Naomi says. We'll come to this here in just a moment, but Naomi is wrong. And she's not wrong to feel this way. In fact, I hope you're using the Pause app. What do? Whatever emotions we have, we acknowledge it, we name it, we invite Jesus into it, okay? So it's not wrong that she would feel this way. But get this, Naomi's not right. The Lord's hand is not turned against her. In fact, it's the pain that would bring about God's plan. Just a little hard to see that in the moment, okay? But here's the most important verse, down in verse 16. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and my God, your God. This is almost like a conversion experience. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Marshal Ney was one of the big generals under Napoleon. Very committed to Napoleon, even more committed to France. And as Napoleon would often do, when a person's usefulness has expired, he would just throw them out with the wash, right? And so he trumped up some charges on Marshal Ney and had him stand before the firing squad for treason. But Marshal Ney, he was the commander of the troops that were to execute him, and so he asked for two final things before his death. Number one, that he would not be blindfolded, and number two, that he would give the order to fire. He was so committed to his country. He said, I'm going to be these people's commander up to the very last. And so he was not blindfolded. He was put in front of the firing squad. He said, men, I order you, make sure you hit my heart. Ready, aim, fire. He was faithful to the very last. That's what Ruth does here. I don't care what it costs me. Even if it means death, I am committed to you no matter what. So we live in a day, and we always have, of easy Christianity. I'm going to follow God as long as it's convenient. I'm going to follow God as long as it feels good. I'll listen to the commands of Christ as long as it doesn't buck my already existing belief and culture a little too much. We are not called to that. We are called, in fact, Jesus would say, whoever wants to follow me must be willing to lay down their lives, and only then you will find it. Listen, Christianity is not about common sense. Now, we use our common sense, but ultimately, Christianity is about tying our fate and our faith to Jesus Christ, come what may. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, and the story of Ruth is like our story as well. Who will we tie our lives to? So just one more quick thing on Naomi, and then we're going to make some applications here. Naomi, if you trace her lineage back, she goes all the way back to Caleb. And you might remember Caleb. He was a friend of Joshua back in the day when the Israelites were coming into the land. He was a man of faith. He was the one swinging his sword up over the hill unto the very last. Well, Caleb's family, like most families, had a rich part and a poor part. Okay, I'm going to do a little poll here in just a minute. But the rich part, we'll meet a guy named Boaz here in just a moment. And so he's kind of the rich part of the family. Naomi was on the poor side of the family. So just for a moment, how many of you look at your family, there was a rich side, but you happen to be born into the poor side of the family? Let me see your hands. Okay. How many of you that there is no rich side of the family? You're all poor. Okay. Okay. By the way, in America, poor is a little bit relative, right? So the Spoos, they were all dirt farmers from time immemorial, right? Naomi just happened to be born in the poor part of the family. Can I give you this before we go into the applications? So was Jesus. He was born into the poor part of the family. Mary and Joseph, poverty, every inclination of that. And Jesus chose to be born into the poor part of the family for us. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, doesn't it? Okay, so let's do some application. There's a lot here as far as history. I hope we've made a little bit of sense of it this morning, but I want to talk about Naomi for a second. I want to talk about Ruth, and then I want to talk about you. So Naomi. Naomi was wrong about God. Verse 13, the Lord's hand has turned against me. Again, it wasn't wrong for her to feel this way, but objectively speaking, she was wrong. The Lord's hand had not turned against her. When life seems at its worst, that's God typically doing something brand new. And so I give this application to those of you who have this complex, and actually it is a psychological complex given a name by doctors. It's called the giving up, given up complex. That you've given up. Your heart may still be beating, but your heart is just not in it anymore. And you're about to give up. Would you just take this as the word of the Lord this morning? Not yet. Hold on. Don't stop. Is life pain? Yes. But it's often in the pain that God is beginning to fulfill his plan. Don't you give up, not yet. Okay. So that's Naomi. Here's Ruth. Ruth, if we were to read this cover to cover, Ruth is about to undergo a substantial transformation. Okay, beginning in the book, she's called a Moabite, which for Israelite ears, that's pretty low, okay? Then Naomi would call her daughter, so would Boaz, and then she would become a woman, and then she would become a wife, and then she would become a mother. And so if you look at the whole arc of Ruth, it's this transformation from being an outsider to being someone that's absolutely essential to God's plan. She undergoes transformation. How does that transformation happen? Through pain. So listen, what are we called to be? We are called to become like Christ. That's the goal. That's the goal of this whole Christian life, is not to go to heaven when we die. That's icing on the cake. The cake itself is you and I become like Jesus Christ. How does that happen? Boy, this is going to kill attendance. Pain. God will use everything in our lives, the good and the bad, the easy and the difficult, the pleasant and the unbearable, to make you more like Jesus Christ. The thing is, he can put something into your life to make you more like Christ, to help you in that transformation, and you can choose not to let that happen. You can decide, no, instead of becoming better, I will become bitter. Instead of becoming like Christ, I will become callous. We see it happening all the time, but only you can make that decision about you. Will you be willing to undergo the painful process of transformation. Again, pain is not against God's plan. It is often God's fulfilling his plan. So let's talk about you for a minute. That's Naomi. She was wrong about God. By the way, you might be wrong about God too. God may be just starting something new. Ruth, she was undergoing transformation. I think she was making history. She just didn't know it yet. Here's you. Attach your life to people moving in the right direction. This is probably the best application I can give you walking away from this. Attach your life to people moving in the right direction. Against Orpah, she followed common sense. She went back to what she knew. Actually, she was just moving in reverse. Ruth going on into the unknown, but she did it attaching her life to Naomi. By the way, just before I forget it, 2 people on their way to Bethlehem out of obedience to God. Isn't that pretty cool? History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Come on, folks. Isn't that cool? That's really cool. That's kind of the picture we're left in the end of chapter 1. 2 people out of obedience to God moving toward Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph is the punchline in case you're missing it right now, okay? Attach your life to people moving in the right direction. What I said a few weeks ago, I need to say over and over again. Attach your life to the shepherd. Don't walk away from the shepherd at the time you need him most, because we still live in an era and a time of compromise and confusion and chaos. And attach your life to the people of God. And it might be this church, it might be another church. In a way I care, but in a way it doesn't matter. You need to attach your life to a group of people who are following Jesus, because if you get outside the flock, you're going to be easy pickings for the enemy. Attach your life to people who are moving in the right direction. And the reward, just listen to this. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall want for nothing. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, even the valley of death, you are with me. Your rod and your staff, your protection and your correction, they never leave me. Even when my enemies are spread out in front of me, there's a table there. And I know that I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Attach your life to people who are moving in the right direction. And so chapter 1 kind of ends with this cliffhanger. Naomi and Ruth, they're arriving to Bethlehem. Again, 2 people arriving to Bethlehem. Still pretty cool, right? Work with me a little bit today. Just give me something, And it says the barley harvest is coming in. So this is a bit of a cliffhanger, because there had been famine up to this point. Now the harvest is coming in. And by the way, here's one more time that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often echoes. Bethlehem is known as the house of bread. And so the bread was coming in. And ultimately, Jesus, the bread of life, would be born there. So, unusual name, Burley Law. I'm just going to read this. Burley Law served as a jungle pilot in Central Africa. One day he took off in clear skies, but shortly he noticed thunderclouds in the distance, and these thunderheads rushed together at startling speed. So Burley frantically searched for an airstrip, but there was nowhere to land. Openings appeared in the clouds here and there, and so he kept turning his plane toward these openings, threading his way like a needle through thread through the fabric of these storm clouds. Burley was lost in the skies, depending entirely on visible navigation. Finally, he spotted a small landing strip. He took the plane down and landed safely. No sooner had the plane rolled to a stop, but a vehicle raced up to his plane, and a nurse jumped out of the plane and said, "I don't care who you are or where you're from, but you're an answer to prayer." This woman was staying with a missionary couple who had been isolated on a remote station for months. There was an unsettled political situation. They were cut off from outside communication because of weather, roads, and bridges were out. The missionary wife had become ill with fever and possible rabies. That morning, they had called the Christians in that village together and prayed earnestly for God's deliverance. That day, God arranged the storm clouds to direct and guide Burley Law and his little plane to that one spot on the earth. Here's the point. God will use the clouds to direct your path. God will use the clouds to direct your path. It's often in the pain that God will fulfill his plan. Let's stand together and let's pray together. Father, thank you for my old friend Mark Twain this morning. Boy, he hit it right on the head. That history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes, and we see a lot of connections between Naomi and Ruth and Mary and Joseph, from the birth of David to the birth of Jesus, to our own lives as well. We live in difficult times, and there are a lot of storm clouds, but God, you have remained unchanged. You still use the clouds to direct us. You still use the pain to fulfill your plan, and your plan is that everything that happens to us would bring us closer to you and more like Jesus Christ. Consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, when you endure trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking a single thing. God, that feels really good, but it's hard in the moment. So thank you that the bread of life is on its way. It's in the name of Jesus, that bread of life, that we offer our prayer. Amen. So I invite you to respond this morning. I invite you to respond, I don't know how. Maybe you just need prayer this morning. Maybe your life is a little bit painful and you've lost that perspective of God's plan bearing out in your life. We had some folks come in the follow-up room in the first service say, I don't know where this is going. If you're there, would you just allow somebody to pray for you today? Maybe you need a church family. You need to connect your life to a group of people who are moving in the right direction. Well, here's a heads up. We get it right sometimes. Other times we struggle to figure that out. But the mission of our church, at least what we've stated, is we want to glorify God in all we do. We want to make God look good. We're not perfect at it. But if you need a less than perfect family, Thanksgiving is a reminder you have a less than perfect family, don't you? Well, get another one. Why not? Double down on that. We're trying to move in the right direction. Or if you need to make a decision to finally quit dilly-dallying with Jesus and just say yes. While we sing, I want you to get up from where you are, walk out the back doors. Hey, you can go to the parking lot if you want to, but I'd rather you come by and see me. And let's talk about whatever decision you need to make. We're not going to force you to make a decision you're not ready to make, especially if you just need somebody to pray over you today. I'll be in the follow-up room in 30 seconds if you want to join me. Come on in. The rest of us, let's worship the Lord together.